A few weeks ago, I made a game in just 1 hour, and it was kind of bad. The music and sound effects were ironic at best, the art was basically non-existent, the game had a whack difficulty curve, my Unity project was a disaster, I didn't even hook up this YouTube button to take you to my channel, and it just felt off. So let's fix it. But first, if projects like this are exciting to you, then subscribe to my channel, because I have a lot more coming. Okay, so I started by cleaning up my code. I split things into a few more files, cleaned up some messy functions, and just made things easier to read. After doing a bit more tidying up around my project, I started to overhaul the art. Now, I'm no artist, and on top of that, I recently switched using GIMP instead of Photoshop in an attempt to stop letting Adobe eat my savings account. So to keep things doable, I used simple shapes like rectangles and circles and played around with effects until I got something that looked right. I started with improving the lasers, trying to give them a bit of a glow. I knew I needed to change the warning for the laser. Previously, there's a slight transparent line that would flash for about 3 seconds before firing the actual laser. This was not visually distinct enough, and most people just figured that the warning could kill you, so I changed it to make a small flash on each side of the screen for a few seconds before shooting the laser across the screen. I leaned into a factory type theme, making a background, walls, and a metal beam roof. I also threw some scorch marks in the background, which I liked a lot but realized I could make a lot cooler. So I decided to make a system that spawns one of 8 scorch marks wherever you die, then it saves the last 5 death locations, and whenever the game loads, it'll spawn them back onto the background. It's small and easy to miss, but it adds a lot to the feel of the game. I was really happy with the background art at this point, so I wanted to start tackling some of the UI. I have an obsession with taking UI elements and moving them into the game world, so I decided to overcomplicate a score system, and I think this was the biggest time waster on this project. But it's also one of my favorite things. My goal was to make an LED display that would be behind the ball, so I made 2 sprites, one that had these lights that are turned on, and one with them turned off. Then I have a script that generates a panel of these lights based on how many rows or columns I specify. And I don't really know why I went with making the system so dynamic, with having them spawned at runtime rather than just placing them in the editor, but it was a fun challenge to conquer either way. So now, with a script, I can switch them on and off by changing the sprites. I just need to find a way to display things onto them. The way I decided to do this was I have an array of 10 elements, which each represent the numbers 0 through 9, and each element has 15 booleans. These each correspond to one of the 15 lights in my 3x5 light panel. So whenever I want to display a number, I first split the score to an integer for the ones, tens, hundreds, and thousands place. Then I pass these individual digits to the corresponding panel. It actually works really well, mostly because each number in the array corresponds with that actual number. I decided to use the same display to show the game over screen, but with only 4 panels, I decided to make the screen read dead when the game ends. I also finally updated the ball sprite at this point. I didn't do anything crazy, but I needed at least a tiny bit of effort, so I made it gray, added a slight shadow, and a glare mark on the opposite side. Then I wanted to give the ball a bouncing effect, and at first I was trying to do it programmatically by scaling the ball image based on the velocity, which I realized would have taken a lot of work to achieve the look I was going for. I eventually decided to make a few animations of it squashing vertically and horizontally, and then just play those animations on collisions or bounces. I made 2 animations for each direction, and I check the velocity of the ball at the time of collision and decide whether to play a big or small squish. And I completely skip the animation if you barely skim a wall or the ceiling. This was making the game feel a lot better, but it still wasn't perfect. I noticed the ball would hit the wall and then play an animation, so I fixed this with 2 changes. First, by adding another trigger on the ball that was slightly bigger than my ball sprite, so this would trigger before the ball actually hit the wall and start playing the animation. The next thing I did was I shrunk the collider of the walls and the ceiling. I did this because whenever I scaled the sprite for the squish animation, the image would shrink, but the physics collider stayed a circle, which would create a slight gap between the object it was hitting and the ball. So by letting the ball go even just a few pixels behind the object, it ensured the 2 objects actually made contact. I also realized I hadn't switched out the explosion effect yet that I threw in at the end of my first video, so I made a shader that would dissolve the ball when you come in contact with the laser. I used Shader Graph for this and was actually really surprised at how easy it was to get the exact effect I wanted. A small tweak that really helps that effect is whenever the ball contacts a laser, its velocity is set to a fixed slow descent, which looks really good as the shader dissolves the ball. It reminds me a lot of how cubes would dissolve if you try and move them into the elevator in Portal. At this point, I felt good calling the art done, which meant I only had a few more tweaks to make. I reworked how the lasers spawn a bit by allowing them to be multiple on screen once you survive for long enough. I did make sure there's always at least 1 bounce amount separated in an attempt to ensure a sense of fairness. I also redid the menu a bit, and I added a title utilizing the display that I made. Then the last thing I wanted to add was an online leaderboard. This was not at all necessary, but I had made one in the past for a small game that I called Astro Ambush, and I knew that it wouldn't be too much work. I used PlayFab, which is a free service provided by Microsoft, that allows you to do stuff like leaderboards or other online features. I use a tutorial by Coco Code that is super easy to follow and implemented it into my project, displaying the leaderboard with a top employee sign to fit the factory theme. This wasn't all smooth sailing though. I ran into a few issues with the leaderboard that were really hard to diagnose. Everything seemed to work fine in the editor, but if I built the game for WebGL, it would sign everyone in as the same player. I was stumped until I put in some debug text and realized that WebGL doesn't have a device unique identifier, which is the system that I was using to log players into their PlayFab profile. So after a little bit of trial and error and some research, I found a script that solves all my issues. It will create a unique identifier for several different build configs, and the way it does it for WebGL is it first checks to see if a unique identifier has been saved in the Unity player prefs, which is a built-in save system in Unity, and if it hasn't, it'll create a new GUID and save it to that spot in player prefs for next time. If you aren't familiar with what a GUID is, it's a global unique identifier, and while it is a randomly created number, its algorithm is created in a way that worrying about creating two of the same GUID is a non-issue. So with that problem solved, I found myself with another one. I wanted the leaderboard to have display names that were just 3 letters, like that would be found in an arcade game, but I didn't realize that PlayFab required display names to be unique, so if 2 players had the same name, it would just show up as nothing. I spent a day looking into this and switching to a different system in PlayFab for tracking names, all just to realize that I could check a box in the PlayFab settings and everything would work how I wanted it to. So with that, the game's done, and I think it's time to compare the two. For reference, this is the original, which is still playable if you want to compare it yourself. Especially after playing the updated version, this one just feels wrong. The music and sound effects sound cheesy, and the gameplay is very boring. It suffers from being too hard without being fair, and the difficulty doesn't really increase after you've survived a while. The worst part about this original's gameplay is the fact that you don't really know how low the ball can fall, which, when paired with less verticality, makes this version pretty annoying. As you would hope, this version's better in pretty much every way. I didn't mention how I changed the sounds, but it makes the game feel so much better. There is an ambient factory track that's playing in the background underneath all the other tweaked laser, ball, and bounce effects. Just sound like you would expect them to, along with much more fitting music in my opinion. This version actually feels pretty fun to me. It starts out relatively easy and slowly gets harder until you reach around 40 bounces. At that point, it doesn't get much harder, but the timings for avoiding lasers are tight enough that it stays interesting even once you're good enough to make it that far. And the leaderboard is a great addition to this game. I've already found myself getting lost trying to beat my own high score or my friends, when I probably should be working on other things. And I'm really proud of this game. I feel like I really fleshed out the simple idea. And while of course there's always more stuff I could add, I'm really happy with how it is right now. Now, I think to conclude the saga, it's important to ask the question of why did I do this? Why did I spend so much time working on a dumb game that few people will play? Especially when I sunk hours into things like the score display, or the leaderboard, or the scorch mark system, which few people would notice. And I did it because I wanted to learn. These are things that I either was not good at, or didn't know how to do. To any aspiring game developer, these are the projects that you should work on. It's easy to keep doing things you know how to do, but it's hard to keep things interesting without trying new things. Wow. This project made me a better developer, and I'll go into my next project with higher confidence because of it. Something that I hope you stick around to watch. So thank you for watching. Consider joining my Discord to get some sporadic updates and chat with other like-minded folks, and if you're looking for a way to support me, subscribing and liking this video go a really long way. And look out for another video soon.